Good day. My name is Brian Lewis and I'm an instructor at JTNS. Today we're going to discuss hazard communication and globally harmonized systems. You may know them as HazCom and GHS. We normally ask people to take 5 or 10 minutes and discuss any near miss or accidents they may have had in the last month. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to and have that discussion. After you've had the discussion, please press play again and we will start the presentation. Alright, now we're going to talk about hazard communication and globally harmonized system, and we're going to talk about this in light of whether you're a new person and this is the first time you've heard this information, or this is a refresher to you. Hopefully there'll be some information in here that reminds you of how important it is to be aware of hazardous chemicals and using them and to protect ourselves. Or if you're someone that needs the update. So we'll go ahead and start that. So just a little bit of information. We're going to talk about why OSHA adopted GHS, or the Globally Harmonized System. We're going to have an overview of changes to the HazCom standard, an overview of the Compliance Assistant Resources, and talk a little bit about the Directorate of Enforcement Programs and the products they offer. So why did OSHA align the hazard communication standard with the globally harmonized systems? Well, they needed a common and coherent approach to classifying and communicating chemical hazards. So we needed definitions that were similar or harmonized together. We needed to meet specific criteria for the labels and a format, a standardized and harmonized format for safety data sheets. And you may have noticed that I said safety data sheets and not material safety data sheets. MSDSs are a thing of the past, and we should be using safety data sheets. You may actually hear me misspeak a couple of times during the presentation where I use the term MSDS or material safety data sheet. That's just a bad habit I need to break. So please forgive me for that. So some benefits of adopting the global harmonization system. Well, it increases the quality and consistency of the information provided to workers, employers, and anyone who uses the chemicals. It can reduce confusion and increase comprehension of the hazards, improve downstream risk management. It helps with training, and it can also make things a little bit more easier to understand for all of us. Other benefits include it facilitates international trade in chemicals. As some of you all are well aware, maybe some of you aren't, but chemicals aren't just manufactured or produced here in America. They're produced all around the world. And anything we can do to facilitate the process of communicating those hazards is going to be good for us, the end users. So the development of the final rule, as you look at it up here, it was published in 2006, published in the Federal Register on September 30th of 2009, as they need to have and are actually required to have public hearings regarding the changes to the hazard communication standard and adoption of GHS were held in 2010. The final rule was published in the Federal Register and became effective on May 25th, 2012. So here are some effective dates, as you can see, starting in 2013 and going all the way up to the present. And the thing you need to know is that the regulation and all its requirements are now fully in effect. So before, we did things in a series. That way it was much more easier for manufacturers, importers, and employers to implement the correct changes. So now everything is in effect. Some changes. Using a specification approach a performance-oriented approach, and hazard classification other than a hazard determination. So used to, employers had to determine what the hazards were and then put those hazards in the material safety data sheet. Now they classify the hazards, and those hazard classifications are included in the safety data sheets. That's an important change, and it's one we'll talk about later. Labels have also changed. There's requirements for the labels. They have to have the product identifier listed prominently on the label. Now, some of you may ask what a product identifier is. That's simply the name of the chemical. There should also be a pictogram or pictograms included in the label prominently that communicate what the hazards of this particular chemical or a particular chemical may be. A signal word. The signal words are warning or danger. Of course, danger is much greater hazard than, say, warning is. Hazard statements. These are a list of statements that talk about the hazards of the chemical. Some precautionary statements are also included on the label about how the chemical should be stored, should be used, and things you can do to avoid accidents. The labels also have to include the name, address, and telephone number of the manufacturer or importer of the chemical in case you need to get in touch with them, which is really important. Safety data sheet, rather than material safety data sheet, is the new term we use for these documents, and they have a 16-section format. As I've said before, I catch myself saying material safety data sheet all the time, and I really need to get into the habit of saying safety data sheet just like everyone else. The 16-section format's important because there were no real requirements for a format, only suggestions under the old hazard communication standard. And so you would have material safety data sheets that might be a half a page to a page long, and you may have had others that were over 100 pages long. The idea of the safety data sheet and the old material safety data sheet is that a worker can go to those documents, find the correct document easily, and quickly look at any hazard that they may be exposed to and learn how to protect themselves from it. So it's really important to have a standard format where people can see what is needed. Guidance in the global harmonization system has been removed to streamline provisions, so keep that in mind. If you're an importer or a manufacturer of a chemical, it really helps them make some good decisions quickly. So how does HazCom work? Well, you're either a manufacturer or you're an importer of a chemical, and you need to develop a safety data sheet as well as a label, and make sure that that information is communicated to the employers as well as employees. Make sure people know what the hazards of that chemical or hazardous chemical are so they can protect themselves. Of course, the employers, they have to prepare or create a written system or a written program that details, among other things, how they're going to use the information they have to protect employees, how they're going to train employees, what kind of requirements will be there for employees. Employees, of course, receive the training and learn how to protect themselves better. That's important. Of course, all containers that are hazardous chemicals have labels. Safety data sheets will be available for employees to go access without having to have a password to get into a computer or having a key to get into a particular room. And workers need to be trained on how to access these safety data sheets, as well as the hazards of the chemicals that they use every day. So how is the final rule organized? Well, it's a purpose, and like most of these standards start out, the first paragraph, paragraph A, has the purpose, paragraph B, scope and application, paragraph C typically, but not always, contains the definitions, D, hazard classification, E, written hazard communication program. Paragraph F will talk about labels and other forms of warning. Paragraph G talks about safety data sheets. Paragraph H, employee information and training. I, trade secrets, and then effective dates, and the appendices A through F is how the standard is organized, and this is typical of most OSHA standards. Appendix A talks about health criteria, health hazard criteria. B, physical hazard criteria, which we'll talk about both of those a little bit more. The allocation of label elements in Appendix C, safety data sheets in Appendix D. Appendix E, the definition of a trade secret, and Appendix F, guideline or guidance for hazard communications, talking about carcinogens and how to deal with those. Employees shall or must train employees regarding the new label requirements and safety data sheets formats by December 1st. Employers shall provide employees with information and training on hazardous chemicals in their work area at the time of their initial assignment and whenever a new hazard is introduced to the work area. Refresher training shall be or must be provided at least annually. So I know quite a few of you, if not the vast majority of you, have had previous training on hazardous chemicals. So for most people, this training is going to be a required refresher training. For others, you should be trained before you receive initial assignment when you have to use hazardous chemicals. So keep that in mind. Need to have some training, need to have some idea of how to protect yourself before someone asks you or requires you to use a hazardous chemical. The training needs to include other issues like label elements, train employees on the type of information that they would expect to see in the new labels, and we'll talk about that some more, how they might use this information. And we've already talked a little bit about the product identifier, signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, all these things that may come in handy to know. General understanding of how the elements interact, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And we have already discussed a little bit about the safety data sheet format that has 16 sections, but we will also talk about that in a little bit more detail. Hazard classification. And we'll talk about this some more. The new safety data sheets have two large sections that talk about health hazards and then another one about physical hazards, and those are subdivided, and we'll talk about those subdivisions a little bit, but this makes the information a little bit more accessible and straightforward for anyone that's trying to figure out what the potential hazards are, and we'll talk about that. Manufacturers are still responsible for determining hazards, so just because the information is not communicated in a format based on hazard determination doesn't mean that they don't have to figure out or determine what kind of hazards are present in the chemicals that they sell you. So keep that in mind. So we look here at health hazards, and you'll see right at the top of the list in the subcategories, acute toxicity. Acute toxicity, I like to think of as poison because it's quick acting. So when I see acute toxicity, I think of something that's really poisonous and that needs to be handled with extreme care. So keep that in mind. Of course, underneath that, you'll see skin corrosion and irritation, then serious eye damage and eye irritation. And those things can be really traumatic for people that are extremely allergic or sensitized to the chemicals. Sensitization just means someone has been exposed to the chemicals enough times that their body has an adverse reaction to it at extremely low levels of exposure. And that happens a lot of times with skin, eye irritation. Of course, respiratory irritation is much more dangerous and needs to be paid attention to much more closely than the other irritations, because you breathing's sort of important to living, right? And so keep that in mind. Anything that causes any kind of respiratory irritation can cause some real serious health problems quickly. Germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenity, these are all, or these two categories are closely related, because if something is a suspected carcinogen or a proven carcinogen, these categories are going to have are going to show some real danger. Once we get past that, reproductive toxicity is listed. Whether you're male or female, if you're interested in having a family, if you're interested in having healthy children, you want to pay attention to reproductive toxicity. This category simply talks about the potential to have trouble for someone being exposed, have trouble having children, or the potential of having birth defects in those children. So it's an important category to pay attention to. STOT, single exposure, and STOT, repeated exposure. These are really two important categories, and I take a little time on these categories. Partly because I don't see a lot of stuff in the information or hear a lot of people talk about this acronym of STOT. So what does STOT stand for? It is specific target organ toxicity. All right, specific target organ toxicity. So under a single exposure, you'll see where a single exposure can affect a specific target organ and be toxic to it. This is really important because that can be really dangerous stuff. Now, specific target organ toxicity for repeated exposure, that means somebody that's repeatedly exposed to a chemical or exposed over a lifetime at lower concentrations may develop health issues later in life. So that's important too. So STOT, single exposure, can really harm you really quickly right then and there. Specific target organ toxicity, repeated exposure, means that you can end up with some sort of a health condition later in life. It's really important. Aspiration just means it's a hazard that can cause problems with you. Basically getting it in your lungs and causing some problems there. And so keep that in mind. Now, physical hazards. And as you see along the left side, it starts out with explosives and flammable gases and flammable type materials, and it goes all the way down through liquids and solids. So of course these are important categories. You need to know if something's going to explode. You need to know if something has the potential to be an explosive dust or an explosive liquid or an aerosol. So these are things that are pretty much put up right up front in the subcategories under the physical hazards, along with pyrophoric liquids, solids, gases, and self-heating chemicals. So some chemicals, when put in certain conditions or mixed with other chemicals, can have what's called an exothermic reaction. In other words, it generates heat. And so we want to be particularly careful with these. That's why when you have oily rags in a shop, they go into a metal container with a metal lid, and those materials are moved at the end of each shift or the end of each day so that fire is not created in case someone puts a chemical in with those oily cotton rags that cause an exothermic reaction. We want to avoid that. That's why that standard's there. So we can also see things in here like corrosive materials, combustible dust, organic peroxides, and oxidizing chemicals. Now, oxidizing chemicals are simply chemicals that under certain conditions release oxygen. and that's important to know. If you have a chemical that when water is applied to it releases oxygen, you're not going to put out a fire, or the fire department will not put out a fire. What they will do is cause the fire to burn hotter and actually grow. So it's important to know what you're dealing with. Hazards not otherwise classified. This definition was added to ensure hazards currently covered by the hazard communication system continue to be covered. So what's really important here is that many, probably hundreds of chemicals, new chemicals, are made every year. And because of that, you have to have a catch-all. You have to have a catch-all. If there's a hazard that does not fit neatly in the health hazard or physical hazard category and the subsequent subcategories, you need to have something there where you can inform people on these particular hazards. And so this is where you put it. This is where you put it. You have to address these hazards in worker training, and it needs to be on the label, okay? So keep that in mind. The approach to labels. Well, it's a specification approach to labels, and you can find more information about that in Appendix C. And it's a cookbook approach that tells you how to do this, how to put it together in the format that it needs to be in. So the label requirements: the product identifier or the name, the signal word, whether it's warning or danger, any kind of hazard statements, pictograms, and any kind of precautionary statements, as well as the name, address, and phone number of the responsible party, which is going to be the company that imported or manufactured the chemical. So here are some pictograms and their hazards, and you can see up there the health hazard. It shows a person with a star in their chest, and that can be a carcinogen. It can represent reproductive toxicity, a whole lot of things. Then, of course, the pictogram with the flame means, of course, that it's flammable. It burns. The exclamation mark, obviously, means it can be a skin or eye irritant. So that's important to know, as well as any other kind of irritant. It's important to keep that in mind. Of course, a gas cylinder means it's a compressed gas hazard, and those can cause all kinds of injuries, especially if they're not treated with caution and care. The corrosive. If you look at that closely, you'll see a vial, and on one end it's pouring on what appears to be a piece of metal. On the other end, liquid looks like it's pouring on a hand, and it's a corrosive, so it's a chemical burn. It's going to cause some burns to your skins or potentially your eyes, and so that's how we want to identify corrosive. The next pictogram is an exploding bomb, and of course you see a little round bomb there with it being exploded and shrapnel being blown out to the right side, and so that's pretty self-explanatory kind of stuff. And we get down here to the bottom left hand corner, and you see a flame over a circle or an O, and what we're talking about, or the hazard we're trying to communicate when that pictogram is present, is that this particular chemical is an oxidizer. It is an oxidizer, and because it's an oxidizer, we need to take special precautions, special care, how we store it, how we handle it, and what we how we deal with it in case of any kind of fire. Now the next one is a non-mandatory for OSHA regulations, and if you look closely, you'll see a dead tree and or a dead fish, and what we're talking about there is an environmental issue. It causes damage to our environment, and people in the South, in Tennessee, a lot of us like to go out to the parks. We've got beautiful parks, beautiful lakes. A lot of people like to fish and hunt and just enjoy nature. So this is a particular interest to all of us, that we have those resources available to us. The very last one, you'll see a skull and crossbones, and if you like old movies, or particularly silent movies, anytime that the bad guy went to poison someone, the poison always had a label of skull and crossbones on it. So that means poison or acute toxicity. So keep that in mind when you see these pictograms. They're not language dependent. They're dependent on you recognizing these symbols and understanding what kind of hazards you're going to have to deal with. So red borders versus black borders. OSHA requires red borders, okay? So if you're going to need to make copies of these safety data sheets that you have, use a color copier so that the pictograms show up on the safety data sheets. If you have to produce labels for your chemical containers, make sure that the pictograms are in red. So OSHA feels, and I think they're absolutely correct, that the red borders pull your eyes into that pictogram and they increase your ability to comprehend what the hazards are. Blank diamonds are not permitted on any label. So I can see people that would like to print up generic labels with pictograms on them, and then at some point having some red diamonds or red squares on point, however you want to call it, with anything or without anything in it. And so OSHA does not want you to do that. If the red borders are there for a reason, they pull your eyes to the pictogram that's inside that diamond, and they want to guard that. They want to guard that. They want to make sure that if there's a red diamond there, you know that there's a hazard that you need to pay attention to. So keep that in mind. Updating labels. So they need to be updated 3 months after getting new and significant information about the hazards. So if a chemical importer or manufacturer of a hazardous chemical has significantly new information, they need to send you some new labels. So keep that in mind. The final rule requires containers shipped 6 months after the information is available to be labeled correctly. So the importers and manufacturers' responsibilities to the employers and to the employees, the end users, it does not end. It has to have a little bit of continuity to it, where they're continually looking at what they need to do and do the right thing. So here's an example of a label. If you notice at the top of that, it's got XYZ chemical, and then you have a series of pictograms, and we'll have an exclamation point, and we'll have a person there that that has a star in their chest, and then we'll have a pictogram with a flame. So we would expect this to be a potential carcinogen, possibly an eye or skin irritant, and also be flammable. Now, our signal word is warning, so it's not quite as bad as danger. But then we'll have some hazard statements there. And if you were able to look really close, you'll see that it talks about having basically specific target organ of a single exposure, and it'll also have a specific target organ of prolonged exposure. And then it'll go into how you need to handle this material, how you need to store it, some first aid information, and what to do in case that this chemical is involved in some sort of a fire. And lastly, it'll have some information on the chemical manufacturer, chemical importer, the entity that's responsible for maintaining the safety data sheets and providing them, is what I should say, providing the safety data sheets and providing the correct labels. So keep that in mind. Workplace labeling. OSHA is maintaining the approach used in the current hazard communication system that allows employers to use workplace-specific labeling, as long as they provide the required information. So keep this in mind if you're one of these companies that really wants to use their own labeling system instead of the labels that are provided. The labels you use must communicate the same hazards as required by the standard. I think that most employers are going to use the labels that are already required. I don't see that most chemicals need to be relabeled for end users. However, there may be companies out there, large chemical manufacturers, that have trained their employees for decades even on their labeling system. So OSHA saying, hey, you can still use your own labeling system, but you need to update it and make sure you communicate all the hazards that are there. Keep that in mind. So the 16-section safety data sheet format, what I'm going to tell you about this is most end users, most employees are going to use sections 2 and section 8. Section 2 tells you what the hazards are, and section 8 tells you how to control the hazard and what PPE to use, right? So section 1 talks about the identification or the name and the mixture and the percentage of the mixture. Section 2 identifies the potential hazards or actual hazards, actual and potential hazards that an end user could be subjected to if they get exposed or overexposed to a hazardous chemical. So that's important information. Section 3, the composition information, ingredients, and the substance of the mixtures. This is active ingredients and things like that. Section 4, first aid measures. What do you do if somebody gets this on them? What do you do if they inhale it? What do you do if they get it in their eyes? That sort of thing. First aid measures. How are you going to do that? Firefighting measures. This is important. And it's also important to have a good relationship with your local fire department. Let them know what kind of hazardous chemicals you've got available and what they might be walking into if your facility ever catches fire. No need in putting those people at extra risk, right? So we should have open communication, and as well as use this information if we decide we're going to fight fires in our own facility, right? Section 6 talks about what to do if you accidentally release it, how to control that and to mitigate any kind of accidental release. Section 7 talks about where it needs to be handled and stored. So in other words, don't subject it to shock, don't store it with oxidizers. That kind of information is going to be found in Section 7. We've already talked a little bit about Section 8. Section 8, you'll find some information in there like eye wash, safety eye wash and shower needs to be present. Use goggles, use apron, use particular kind of glove, use with respirator or local exhaust ventilation, or use with general ventilation or outside, things like that. Section 9, physical and chemical properties. Now this can be really important, and I don't want to gloss over it too much because you're going to find information in here like the specific gravity. And you may say, well, what does that mean to me? Why do I care? Well, if something floats on water and it's flammable and you spray it with water to try and put it out, you're just going to spread the fire. If it sinks in water, then you may have other considerations on how you're going to handle that chemical. So keep that in mind. Also, as far as permit required confined spaces, if something's lighter than air, then it's going to accumulate at the top of the space. If it's heavier than air, then it's going to accumulate in the bottom of the space. If it's roughly the same weight as air, there's a potential for that substance to pocket. And so when you're using your sniffer to try and figure out where this chemical is so that an entrant can go into this space, it's important to know where to look. It's important to know where to look for these hazardous chemicals that can cause real serious health effects, real serious hazards, and really limit or eliminate a person's ability to self-rescue or basically to walk out of the space. So keep that in mind. Stability and reactivity. This is an important section also. It lets you know if you need to worry about how you handle it and how stable it is under certain conditions. Section 11, toxicological information. This is where you're going to find stuff on, does it affect an unborn child? Does it affect people's ability to have children? You also find things like LD50 and LD100 numbers, and what all that means is LD stands for lethal dose. So when they test some of these chemicals on animal populations, they understand how many ounces per pound or grams per kilogram it takes to kill half the population, and that's the LD50 number, or to give it cancer in some cases. The LD100 number is the amount it takes to kill 100% of that population, or to give 100% of that population cancer. And there again, these numbers are in ratios of ounces per pounds, grams per kilogram. And so that's good information to have. Good information to have. So keep that in mind. Ecological information and disposal considerations, these are non-mandatory. Section 14, transportation information, 15, regulatory information. All those sections right there, 12, 13, 14, and 15, they're non-mandatory, but they're going to have to do mainly with DOT and EPA type regulations and information. So keep that in mind. Of course, section 16 is other information, including information in the preparation and the revision of the safety data sheets. That's really important stuff right there. Your safety data sheets should be kept up to date. They should be you should make sure that your safety data sheet is within a couple of years of being accurate. So chemical formulas change, chemicals change, and so you should make sure that the date on your safety data sheets is at least within the last 2 years. So keep that in mind. So let's review for a little bit. For employers are responsible for initial training on the label elements, minimal training on the new safety data sheet format. They have to continue and update the safety data sheets, as we just talked about, and review the HazCom, or the Hazard Communication Program, and update as necessary. So anytime there's a change in the workplace, a change in chemicals, you need to review that. And do we need to make some amendments to our written program? Do we need to call people in and have them retrained or have new training to make sure they understand the hazards of this new chemical they might be using? For manufacturers, they have the burden of the initial startup cost associated with the reclassification and producing new labels and safety data sheets used in the training. So keep that in mind. OSHA is developing a lot of guidance materials. So they have quick cards, briefs, booklets, small entity compliance guides, technical materials. All this stuff is important. All of it's available at the www.osha.gov website. You have web applications that people can use, and that's important also, right? So you can go to these web pages and look things up. I certainly appreciate your time, and I certainly appreciate you paying attention to everything that's going on. I hope that this has been informative, and I hope that you can use this information to protect yourself from hazardous chemicals. If you have any questions, I encourage you to discuss amongst yourselves. Discuss with the person responsible for safety and health at your workplace. And if you need to, please contact the JTNS instructor that services your facility, that comes by your utility, and give them an opportunity to help you with any questions you've got. Doesn't mean that we know the answer to every question off the top of our head, but we will research any question we don't have the answer to and get back with you. Thanks. Y'all have a great day. Bye.